Moving swiftly on, the final item of business today is a members' business debate on motion number 6308 in the name of Christina-McKelvie on MND-Scotland-Welfare-Reform. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put. For those members who wish to speak in the debate, please press the request to speak buttons now or as soon as possible. And if you are ready, Ms McKelvie, if you'd like to open the debate, 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And can I take this opportunity at the beginning of this debate to thank all the members who signed this motion to allow it to be discussed today. It's a very important topic and I'm very grateful to the members across parties who signed it to make it happen. Can I also give my heartfelt thanks to MND Scotland, especially Susan Webster and Craig, and I think Brian, they're all up in the gallery today, for their whole team, for their advice, their guidance and the support that they've not only given us across the Parliament, but to the people that they care for. And can I also very quickly say thank you to Hannah at Capability Scotland for her very informative briefing that she sent members last night. Presiding Officer, we tend to open these members' debate with the words, "I'm delighted to open this debate." Well, today I'm heart sorry to open this debate. I'm heart sorry we actually have to have this debate, and I'm heart sorry for the people living with MND, and heart sorry for the families coming to terms with such a shocking diagnosis. Members will no doubt understand the reasons why I personally stand here today. I was that family member coming to terms with my dad being diagnosed with MND. I was that child who grew up with my dad progressively losing all his motor capability. My mum had 3 children at home and worked part-time at night so that we could look after them at night when we were home from school. She went out to work to make ends meet when my dad had to give up his job. I remember both my parents facing the indignity of 4 bus journeys to get assessed to see if he was bad enough to get sickness allowance. 4 just bus journeys for a man who could barely walk and had by that time no power in his arms at all. Presiding Officer, that was nearly 30 years ago. And it's tragic that 30 years on, people with MND and their families are facing such indignity again. A diagnosis of Motor-Neurone-Disease is a devastating blow for a family. The last thing they expect is to be put through the mill of DWP welfare benefits assessments, questionnaires, appeals, and the worry that they might not be able to support their families financially through a traumatic time. Can you imagine, Presiding Officer, the roller coaster of emotions that a family will go through at such a testing times? Unfortunately, as a result of the insidious welfare reform, this is exactly what is happening to many people with MND and their families. MND Scotland is campaigning to highlight the dreadful impact of current and proposed welfare reform on people with the condition. MND Scotland's energy, Presiding Officer, should be spent supporting these families, but they've had no option but to join the increasingly louder calls for this horrible policy to be dropped. MND Scotland has published a report. It's called Time to Benefit People with MND, and I emailed the link to all members yesterday, but I know that MND Scotland has sent it out. They have a few things that they want to make life easier for people with MND at a stage in their life when life couldn't get any harder. Number 1, people with MND should be exempt from the work capability assessment and allocated to the Employment and Support Allowance Support Group. 100% of people with MND supported by the team at MND Scotland are allocated to this group. Putting them through this highly stressful process is a waste of taxpayers' money. 2, people with MND unable to share a bedroom because they need an array of equipment to keep them safe at night and or if their home has been significantly adapted for their needs should not be ever subjected to the bedroom tax or forced to move from that adapted home. 3, people with MND currently in higher rates of disability living allowance, DLA, mobility and care components should not be forced to go through reassessment for personal independent payments, which have only come in this week. It is medically impossible for this illness to get any better. They will not get any better. They will not make any improvement. They should not be put through these assessments. So MND have sent out this report, Time to Benefit People with MND, to MPs, MSPs, including Ian Duncan-Smith, including Lord Freud, the Minister for Welfare, the Westminster All-Party Parliamentary Group for MND and the Scottish Parliament's Welfare Reform Committee. I urge all of those people to take the time to read and act on the very small asks, the asks I have just spoken about, that this report suggests. But let's look at some of the real people that are affected. Because we talk about these policies and we don't realise sometimes the real people that are affected. Employment support allowance, for instance, under incapacity benefit, people with MND were exempt from going through a medical assessment and awarded the full benefit from the outset. This exemption was moved from incapacity benefit, replaced by employment support allowance in 2008. Jamie is one of the case studies on the MND website. He's 40 years old, he has MND, he lives in the north of Scotland with his wife and 3-year-old daughter. Jamie was employed as a mechanical technician but had to give up work when his motor function deteriorated and his arms became very weak. A picture I can see very clearly in my mind, that's what happened to my dad. Jamie was assessed for employment support allowance, but he failed the work capability assessment, He was only awarded 9 points and deemed fit for work. How outrageous. He appealed the decision, but had to wait 1 year. These people, from diagnosis to their untimely death, the average is 14 months. He waited 1 year to be heard and was only provided with the basic rate of benefit during this time. He eventually won his appeal at tribunal and was awarded a further 22 points. However, Jamie was put into the work-related activity group, meaning entitlement to ESA ran out after 1 year. Yeah, you guessed it, they backdated his money for a year, then took it off him. The bedroom tax. As people with MND lose their ability to walk, speak, feed themselves or breathe unaided, they come to rely on a wide variety of equipment to assist them in their daily living. Much as this equipment, such as electric wheelchairs, special medical beds, hoists, breathing equipment and special aids are needed in the bedroom to help the person with MND to keep them safe during the night. This equipment makes it very difficult for a spouse or a partner to sleep in the same room. Often the carer will sleep in a second bedroom and catch some much needed sleep. William, who has MND, and his wife Carol live in the west of Scotland and they have 2 wheelchairs. They have been subjected to the bedroom tax. They will go on the local authority waiting list until a suitably adapted 1-bedroom property is found or one that is adapted for them. William and Carol should never have to go through this. And I've not even got time to go into the personal independence payment, but again, families being told they're being forced to go through the assessment. MND Scotland says in its report, and I couldn't say any better, so I'm just going to quote them, "We appeal to the UK Government to alleviate some of the burden for people with MND and their families. We urge them to adopt a common sense approach by acknowledging that not only are people with MND unjustly suffering through welfare reform, assessing them for welfare benefits they are clearly entitled to is a waste of taxpayers' money. Presiding officer, let this Parliament, our Scottish Parliament, lend its voice to that appeal and urge the UK Government to have some compassion and think again about the real people involved." Thank you.
Thank you. I now call on Drew Smith to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and can I thank Christina-McKelvie for bringing this important debate to the Chamber this evening. We have heard that every year 130 people in Scotland are diagnosed with motor-neurone-disease. MND is a rapidly progressing terminal neurological disease, and people who are diagnosed with illness usually, as Christina-McKelvie said, become severely disabled with symptoms including losing their ability to walk, speak, feed themselves and breathe unaided. The damage caused by MND is progressive, and people suffering from this life-limiting disease do not experience periods of improvement, and sadly, average life expectancy following a diagnosis of MND is just 14 months. The motion before us asks us to acknowledge MND-Scotland-Welfare Reform campaign Time to Benefit People with MND, and I want to commend also the work that MND Scotland have done to highlight the impact these reforms will have on people with MND, as well as all the work they do to support people who are suffering from this illness, particularly on advice and support services, which is mentioned in the motion, but unfortunately I'll not have time to come on to that in this short debate this evening. Most of us in this chamber, Presiding Officer, agreed on the devastating effects of some of the coalition government's welfare reforms are having and will have on our constituents and the areas that we represent. Simplification of the benefit system through, for example, the introduction of universal credit is an example of where the UK Government have probably got the broad approach right. However, it is both in the implementation and the cutting of support for individuals where their approach goes awry. However, the motion which Christina-McKelvie has put before us, before the Parliament, principally concerns or certainly highlights the issue of the bedroom tax, so I wanted to concentrate my remarks to that measure. We know that 79% of households affected by the bedroom tax do include a disabled person. For people who are suffering from MND, Christina-McKelvie is quite right to say this space is not a spare room, but it's somewhere perhaps to keep their wheelchair, a hoist, breathing equipment and speaking aids. This equipment keeps the person suffering from MND safe at night, but some of the equipment can often be noisy, which means that their partner may need that separate room to sleep in. Furthermore, these houses are often specially adapted for tenants and owners with disabilities. Therefore, any move may well incur more cost, as the new property will also have to be suitably adapted. Local authorities have, of course, said that they do not have the housing stock available to meet the demands created by the bedroom tax, and for that reason, as well as the injustices faced by individuals and groups of people with particular conditions, I think the bedroom tax is at best a misguided policy solution to a problem which is really about lack of affordable and appropriate housing supply. People with MND will be affected not just by bedroom tax. The Time to Benefit People with MND report also highlights the impact that changes to employment and support allowance and the personal independence payment, which are being rolled out this month, will have. To my mind, Presiding Officer, it simply must be possible to achieve a fairer way of assessing need, which recognises that people with some conditions are unfortunately not going to get better or even experience significant fluctuations in the severity of their conditions, which means that their capacity to work is likely to change drastically. The position which sufferers of MND are in indicates that there are real problems with the system which the coalition government is putting in place. And indeed, I think we should recognise, and Christina-McKelvie was right to highlight this, the previous system was itself very far from perfect for many of these people, and therefore the whole thing represents an opportunity missed. In closing, Presiding Officer, I want to just return very briefly to the issue of the bedroom tax and repeat something which I've said before, which is that as this Parliament as a whole across the parties, we have failed on this issue. I happen to take the view that what Ed Miliband said last week about localising decisions about housing support and coupling the issue of support with housing supply is overall the correct way to go. And notwithstanding the Scottish Government's announcements today, which didn't, for me, clarify any plans for a separate Scottish welfare system, I do accept that people who support independence do genuinely believe that Scotland could on its own create a fairer system. The issue for me is what we do in the meantime. What we do now for people affected by MND. On that issue, we as a Parliament have failed to put in place either the money, the policies or the guidance to protect people from being unfairly penalised by the bedroom tax. And I hope that all members who take part in this debate tonight will resolve to come together and work together to deliver real support for the real people who are suffering, not just in 2014, 2015 or 2016, Presiding Officer, but today in 2013.
Many thanks. I now call on Kenneth Gibson to be followed by Alex Johnston.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I congratulate my colleague Christina-McKelvie on securing this important debate this evening. I recall the day just over a decade ago when I was told that my Aunt Eileen, my father's older sister, had motor-neurone-disease, and over the next 22 months prior to her death, my aunt became increasingly trapped in her own body, unable to move or speak, to her great torment. Her suffering caused great distress to the entire family, who felt helpless to assist her and even slow in any way her inexorable decline towards death. Motor neuron disease occurs when specialist motor neurons in the brain and spinal cord stop working properly. And because of its poor prognosis, fewer than 400 people have the illness at any one time in Scotland. Motor neurons control important muscle activities such as gripping, walking, speaking, swallowing, breathing, and as the condition progresses, people with MND will find these activities increasingly difficult and eventually impossible to do. MND is one of the rarest neurological conditions and mainly affects adults who are over 40, and most cases develop in people between 50 and 70 years of age. The causes are unknown, but it seems likely that genes play a factor, at least in some people with the condition. This is because 10% of people who develop MND also have a close family relative with it. Motor-neurone disease is a degenerative condition which rapidly progresses, and sufferers have complex needs that affect all aspects of their lives. Maintaining the ability to communicate is essential, and every effort should be made to encourage advanced care planning to ensure autonomy during the course of the disease. MND-Scotland is the only motor neurone disease charity in Scotland providing care, information and funding for research, and it believes that the last months of a person's life should be spent in the loving care and support of their family, not going through highly stressful department for work and pensions, questionnaires, interviews and medical assessments with the constant anxiety that the family could have their benefits removed at any point. Putting people with MND through this process is illogical, a waste of taxpayers' money and just plain daft. From the 1st of April 2013, as we've heard, social sector households which contain working age claimants of housing benefit deemed to under-occupy the property have had their housing benefit reduced. MND sufferers were inexplicably included. With the forthcoming introduction of universal credit and resulting reduction of disability premiums, people with MND could also potentially lose up to £70 a week from their benefit entitlement. The DWP and the UK Government has not taken cognizance of specific groups in their blunderbuss approach to welfare reform. And as Christina-McKelvie said, and it's worth repeating, there is a need to exempt people with MND from the work capability assessment, allocate them to the employment and support allowance support group and award full benefit. It's also sensible to exempt them from the bedroom tax, those who have had their homes significantly adapted to needs and are unable to share a bedroom due to an array of medical equipment necessary to keep them safe during the night. Automatically transfer without assessment people with MND to the enhanced rate of personal independence payments when they are receiving high rates of disability allowance, mobility and care components, and under special rules extended timescale at death from terminal illness can reasonably be expected from 6 to 12 months. Families dealing with a devastating terminal illness such as MND should not be forced to go through the additional stress and anxiety caused by cuts to the welfare programme. And the UK Government should alleviate some of the burden for people with MND and their families. We urge them to adopt a common sense approach by acknowledging that not only are people with MND unjustly suffering through welfare reform, assessing them for welfare benefits they are clearly entitled to is actually cruel. Volunteers in the Scottish Parliament are being urged to participate in a project to record their speech to help potentially reconstruct patient voices that have been damaged through motor-neurone disease. I, along with Christina-McKelvie, would urge people to volunteer to help give patients their voices back as part of the MND Voice Bank project. This will be set up in the Scottish Parliament for the next 2 months and is organised by the Ewan MacDonald Centre and Edinburgh University Informatics team. Many individuals with MND and other devastating conditions such as stroke, MS and Parkinson's disease lose their voice, but this project aims to use recorded donor voices to reconstruct the patients as near to the original voice as possible. Thank you, President Officer.
Thank you. I now call on Alex Johnson to be followed by George Adam.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. While I have no family experience of motor neurone disease, I am aware that it's an extremely debilitating disease which results in severe impairment to a person's physical abilities and is ultimately terminal. Naturally, people with motor neurone disease, when required, have their additional needs supported through the welfare system. I note, however, that the UK Government is not cutting support to disabled people. The Government will continue to spend around £13 billion a year on PIP, and the same as it does under the current system. The introduction of personal independence plans will make sure that the billions spent give more targeted support to those who have the greatest need. As such, it's quite different to the unreformed disability living allowance. The Personal Independence Plan assessment is an individual consideration of how impairments affect a person's life rather than simply being based on medical conditions. It will consider the particular circumstances and support needs of a claimant. There will be a range of help and support available in making PIP applications. The overall process will be independently reviewed soon after it's introduced to ensure that it's working effectively. The fact is that there will be difficulties as a result of the transition to the new benefit, and many of them have been highlighted by those who have spoken in this debate so far. Issues concerning the under-occupancy charge should be dealt with effectively through either the list of exemptions or the discretionary housing fund. But for those who have been recently diagnosed, and perhaps those whose condition does not deteriorate so quickly, there has been some concern over the way in which this has been handled. I commend the work of MND Scotland for highlighting the problems that exist, and I am keen to ensure that wherever possible, the views that they have expressed are taken into account. I will take the opportunity to raise the matters that have been raised by MND Scotland with representatives of the Westminster Government at the next opportunity I have to meet them. And I will ensure that where we have a process in place today which is resulting in poor or inappropriate outcomes, that process is properly assessed, adapted and changed to ensure that it meets the needs of those who depend on the support that these new benefits will supply.
Thank you very much. And I now call on George Adam, after which we'll move to the Minister for the closing speech.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I thank Christina-McKelvie for bringing this debate to us, because I understand how difficult it can be talking about something that's so hugely personal. Normally, when I'm sitting here discussing these things, it's about Stacey and multiple sclerosis, and it does make your speech even harder, because you're aware of absolutely everything that goes on, and you feel the pressure to make sure that you can deliver for the organisation that you're also doing it. But one of my first actual run-in with MND was my grand sister, who, I was just a child, and she deteriorated quite quickly, and we just didn't understand as a child how this woman could no longer speak. She used to work in the mill in Paisley, and all of a sudden she just couldn't function any longer. And as a child, I remember it's something that I always remembered. And as time moved on, you know, in my politics, people have always motivated me. And I'm aware of Christina's family involvement with MND, and I understand that as well. And working with supporting families in Paisley has been a major part of my life. And Eileen Clark, mother of a good friend of mine, Councillor Lorraine Cameron in Renfrew Council, her mother was diagnosed with MND during a time when I was actually a councillor with her. And I physically saw a change from a bright woman involved in the community to just dying. It is effectively a death sentence for these people who are involved. And Lorraine actually told me, I spoke to her today and I asked her, I said, you know, do you mind if I mention these things, and do you mind if I use it? And she says, yes, George, I want people to know. And I also made a joke, because Lorraine had some mental health problems herself during that period, because of the strain, because of the pressure. And she says, and I says, I'll not tell them about the time you went off your head. And she went, no, tell them. She says, that's an important part of it. She says, because the families felt the strain. The families were the ones that, she says, I don't know anybody in MND Renfrewshire who isn't on antidepressants. Family members who are dealing with the situation. And she used to talk to me about times where she would sit there at night and listen to her mother in the next room. Listen to her breathing. You know, had she stopped breathing? Was she still okay? And, you know, people are dealing with this for years, knowing what the outcome's going to be. So because MND-Scotland already stated that the diagnosis to your life expectancy is about 14 months. And Christine-McKelvie's already said that. So you've got 14 months for families to watch their loved one deteriorating at an alarming rate in front of them, not being able to do anything, not being able to do it. And on top of all that, they've had to deal with situations like make sure they can get their housing situation sorted out. Is their house adapted? The disease, by its very nature, makes it difficult for local authorities and government organisations to actually assess it, because it can either be one person's okay at one point, they've deteriorated so long, their house is made adapted for them, and then it's too late. You know, and on top of all that, we have the current situation where we have the reforms, which are going to make a dramatic change. You know, this is an excellent piece of work that MND-Scotland have done with the time to benefit people with MND, and they bring up some of the things that, you know, you just have to take for granted. I agree with their campaign that the last months of a person's life should be spent in the loving care and support of their family. And that should be the way it should be. It shouldn't be worrying about assessments and whether they can actually get DLA or what is now PIP. I know Christina couldn't mention the personal independence payment, so I'll go on about it. Someone who receives a diagnosis for MND will be assessed for personal independence from October. Those who currently receive DLA and report change to their illness will be reassessed. Under PIP, due to the loss of the lower rate, many people who have MND in the early stages of their illness will lose out financially. So you'll end up with people not only having, as Christina already mentioned, they'll have the financial burden as well as being, and they will feel as if they're a burden on their family, because I know that Eileen Clark felt the exact same way herself as she went on, and she got to the stage where she felt she was holding her family back. So, you know, I would say with everyone else here, and I would stress that, you know, we're dealing with people's lives quite literally here, and we're dealing with families, and the last thing they need to be doing is worrying about going through assessments for various benefits. I think we need to show some humanity here and ask the Westminster Government to think again on this issue.
Many thanks. I'll now call on Minister Margaret Burgess. 7 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'd also like to thank Christina-McKelvie for bringing this issue to the Chamber. She's a great champion for those with motor-neurone disease, and I know, and she's explained, it's something she cares deeply and passionately about. We've heard many heartrending stories about the impact of this condition on people and their families, and I certainly like to put my thanks also on record to MND Scotland for all the invaluable support that they provide to people living with this illness. We know that they need immediate support and care given the prognosis, so this makes it all the more important that they get the right support at the right time from the health service and social services. And that support is even more important as the UK Government's ill-judged cuts and changes to the welfare system take effect. I know these reforms are causing a great deal of worry and upset for many people, and one of the biggest concerns continues to be the flawed work capability assessment. And the DWP has made it clear that unless a condition in their definition is terminal, which is if a doctor will say there's a 6 months lifespan, there's no automatic exemption from assessments regardless of disability or health condition. But what they can do is make a decision on whether or not to refer someone for an assessment at the start of the claim based on the evidence provided by the person making the claim and their healthcare professional. And we've heard from everyone in this room exactly the lifespan and the condition of MND, and it seems in many cases it's an absolute nonsense that those people are sent for an assessment, and I would agree with all the members that have said that that is, I think Kenneth Gibson described it as plain daft. And it seems to me that the DWP are failing to take account of the evidence that they're provided with, and this is backed up with many letters we all receive on this issue. And the Scottish Government has raised concerns about the welfare reforms with the UK ministers on a number of occasions, and the Deputy First Minister recently wrote to Ian Duncan-Smith specifically on the work capability assessment process. And despite 3 independent reviews, it's still not working. There's yet another review underway which will be carried out by Dr Paul Litchfield, and we have pressed the DWP to make sure that this latest review finally produces a process that's fair and equitable. The bedroom tax we've heard about from a number of members is another flawed policy that just won't work. The example included in the motion is a tragic case which perfectly demonstrates the indiscriminate effect of this shameless reform. It takes no account whatsoever of the circumstances of the individual concerned. And 79% of households in Scotland affected by the bedroom tax contain an adult who has a disability recognised under the Disability Discrimination Act. And during the passage of the UK Welfare Reform Bill, the Scottish Government made our objections to this reform clear, and we asked for it to be withdrawn. We are especially mindful of the impact on disabled people, and we pressed for a specific exemption to safeguard those whose houses had been substantially adapted, often at considerable cost to the local authorities. But while acknowledging the issue, the UK Government's preferred response is to increase discretionary housing payments for local authorities to deal with, as they describe it, hard cases, specifically aimed for those who have substantially adapted houses. But this doesn't provide the safeguard that a statutory exemption provides. If exemptions can be made for foster and kinship carer and those serving in the armed forces, which I welcome, then surely substantially adapted disabled houses should also be exempt. But Scotland receives 6.5% of the total DHP budget. Scotland and London have the same number affected by the bedroom tax, but for 2013-14, Scotland will receive £10 million in DHP, compared with £56.6 million for London. And that's not fair. It's not a problem here in Scotland. The bedroom tax problem is a problem in the south-east of England, and particularly in London. And I've repeatedly asked for an increase in discretionary housing payment, and will continue to ask for this to alleviate the impact on our vulnerable people and those with an illness or disability. The bedroom tax simply has no place in Scotland. And I would note that the expert group in welfare report which was published today, and I'm sure it will be an important staging post in the debate to come. I welcome the contributions and note some of the themes emerging from the report, such as treating people and benefits with respect, and I echo those calls. People too ill to work or unable to find work or obtain work should not be stigmatised. They don't choose to be in the position they're in, and therefore they shouldn't be penalised for it. And at heart, the independence debate is about choices, ensuring that key decisions about what we want from our society and about Scotland's future are made by the people of Scotland who live and work in Scotland. And we can only achieve this fairer welfare system that will ensure fair and decent support for people through independence and with full control over welfare issues. And I have to say, I know this is not a political debate, but in Ruth Smith's point, it has to be said that both parties, all parties in Westminster, have now committed to keeping the bedroom tax and keeping the benefit system as it is, and there will be no improvement for that. So the only option is the option that we are putting to the people of Scotland, and that is the option of in control of our own welfare system and making decisions that are right for Scotland. But as a Scottish Government, we've already set out measures a Scottish Government would take with a yes vote, such as repealing the bedroom tax and separating housing benefit from universal credit. We as a Government, as a Scottish Government, have a high level of ambition for Scotland and our people, and we are determined to address the root causes of poverty and inequality and to bring about the change that our nation and communities need, and that people who are suffering from illnesses and long-term conditions are not going through the indignity that people are currently going through under the present welfare system.
Many thanks. And that concludes this evening's business. I now close this meeting of Parliament.